My name is Jonas Niklas. I work at a company in Gothenburg in Sweden called eLabs. We're a Rails consultancy. If you're ever in town, you should come by. We have an awesome new office. It's pretty cool. I'm not a software engineer. I guess many of you who are here today aren't really software engineers. I don't really have a formal degree. I never went to college for software engineering or computer science or anything even close to that. Just a quick question. How many of you don't actually have a software engineering or CS degree? That's pretty much almost everyone. Does anyone actually have a software engineering or a CS degree? All right. That was a couple of people. All right. Okay, cool. That's actually one thing I really like about the Ruby community. We come from all kinds of different backgrounds. I have a couple of friends who are artists who got into the Ruby community. I know a pianist who's now a high-profile Rubyist, psychologists, business people. We come from everywhere, and I think that's a really cool thing. And it's a good thing that we sort of share this background of where we come from, and that's kind of why I'm here today. While I was at college, I studied a field called industrial design engineering, which is kind of like industrial design, but looking at it more from an engineering perspective. And I feel that I learned some interesting stuff. And that's why I'm here today, and that's what I want to share with you guys. So we've been talking a lot about what programming is. And some people say that programming is engineering. And Glenn Vanderberg has this really interesting presentation called Real Software Engineering. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. He talks about how this notion of programming as software engineering is really misunderstood and how we can make a better model out of that and how software engineering and programming can be mapped better together. And we've also talked about programming as a craft. And that's really interesting to me. I really like the idea of sort of learning from master programmers and sharing our knowledge and learning from each other. And we've talked about programming as art. And I think there are elements of art in programming, but the way I've been taught what art is that art is something you make for yourself, whereas design is something you make for someone else. I really hope that when we're building software not just for our own interests, but for other people who will be working with our code, for other people who will be using our software projects, for other people who will be using our libraries. I really hope that we're not just making everything for ourselves. And I think certainly there are aspects of art in programming. A lot of the stuff that Y made, I think, can be called art. A lot of the sort of more esoteric projects. If you were at RailsConf this year, they had this really amazing presentation. I think it was called 99 Programming Languages or something. And they were showing off a lot of different languages in a really short space of time. It was all very arty and very weird. And I think that's fantastic, and I really love that aspect of programming. But even in traditional design, there are lots of aspects of art. I think we can look at coding as making something for someone else. Because I think code is designed for people, not machines. This is, for me, the sort of principal innovation that Ruby came with. It's not really different from other languages in a feature perspective. It's not really different from a technical perspective, except that it's slower. But it is the it is the first language that was kind of designed with people in mind. It was designed to make people happy. All other programming languages pretty much were designed with some kind of technical goal in mind. Perl was designed for shell scripting. JavaScript was designed as a programming language for the web. Java was designed as a portable cross-platform language. So always we have a kind of technical motivation for building something, whereas with Ruby we had a human motivation to make people happy. And I really want to encourage you to, when you're writing code, to look at it the same way, that you're building your code for people, not machines. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the theory, a bit of theory behind product design and how we can apply that to our code. I'm going to talk about personas. I'm going to talk about what makes a well-designed product. I'm going to talk about what pleasure is. And I'm going to give some practical tips on tools you can use to apply this knowledge to your software projects. So let's talk a bit about personas. Personas is basically describing what a person using your product is like. And in this case, your product is your code. So another person using your product would be another developer. And you could be thinking that, well, I can just look at myself and look at what I'm like, because all the other people who look at this program, surely they must be exactly like me. But I think you'd be wrong. I think you'd find that in this community, we are very diverse, and we come from lots of different backgrounds. So know who you are designing for. Who are they, and what do they want? Who is your target audience? Because you always have a target audience when you're building code. Your target audience could be just the other developers at your company. Or the target audience could even be you a month in the future. Because you've most likely forgotten pretty much everything about your code at that point. Know what their skill level is like. It's a very different game designing code for a Haskell programmer as opposed to for a QBasic programmer. I remember I started out when I was 7 and I built all this awesome stuff with BASIC. So obviously a 7-year-old can understand BASIC, but a 7-year-old's not going to be able to understand Haskell. I think even in our community there can be vast cultural differences between programmers. We come from Europe, we come from Japan, we come from America. And even being over here, I always notice how hugely different the culture is, so keep that in mind. What makes a well-designed product? One of my personal heroes is a guy called Patrick Jordan. He's a usability expert, and he's been working in the field of usability for quite a while. He's been publishing books and holding talks, and sort of pushing the boundary of what usability is, and trying to get companies to take a more holistic view of their products. And he's proposed this model of what makes a well-designed product. It's basically a 3-tier model, where in the first tier we have functionality. If your product, if your code doesn't solve the problem that the user wants it to solve, it is useless to your user. And on the second tier we have usability. If the user cannot actually physically use your product, even if it has the right functionality, it is useless to them. So for physical products, here we're talking about maybe the strength required to move a lever, or the distance between controls, anthropometric data on people, so that you can actually physically use a product. Obviously, that's not really as important for us as software people, because usually our products aren't physical. But here we even talk about cognitive demands. Understanding things places cognitive strain on people. So in order to be able to understand how something works, we need to spend effort, and the amount of effort we can spend is limited. And the third tier in this model is called pleasure. And by that he means that if the product is functional, if it provides the correct functionality, and if it is usable to the user, it is then important that the user actually enjoys using the product. Because if he enjoys the product, he's going to use it more, and he's going to recommend it more. And in the end, it's going to make you more money or fame or whatever it is you want. So let's look at each of these in turn a bit. Functionality. It's actually really difficult to find examples of products which do this really badly, because most of the products that do this badly just fail very early on and are never heard from again. This is one of those examples. It's called the iTop. It's a wearable DVD player, which you can so you can watch DVDs while you're walking around town or while you're driving your car. Terrible idea, right? Absolutely terrible idea. And unsurprisingly, it totally failed. No one wants to watch DVDs while they're driving around in their car. Or at least I hope they don't. I think I really struggle to find an example for this from the Ruby community. I think this might be one. Joomla kind of makes you move your gemspec file from your gemspec file to your rake file and then generate that gemspec file again. I don't really know how that's useful at all when you can just write the gemspec file to begin with. So I don't know, a lot of people still use it. Google, I think, did this really well. When Google came into the market, what they brought to the market wasn't some kind of superior usability. I think the clean interface they had was pretty innovative. But I think what really made them successful was that they were the first ones to actually get the functionality right. People were sort of screaming for a better search engine. It was really tough finding good stuff on the web. I remember in the early days, I was sort of constantly switching back between different search engines, trying to find something, and it never really quite worked, and then Google came, and it was like, whoa. So they got the functionality right. Also PHP. At a time when web development was really complicated, they just came with everything that you needed built into the language. It had a templating system, it had database drivers, it had everything built in. So it just had all the right functionality. It might not have been the super most pleasant experience out there, but they got the functionality right, and that made them win. So if we look at that second tier layer, usability, we can see stuff like microwaves. I hate microwaves. Death to microwaves. Microwaves are terrible because they always look like this. Essentially, a microwave is a very simple thing. You put food on it and you make it warm. And it should really have two controls, time and power, and nothing else. What are all these 15 million buttons for? I have no idea. It's like a pizza functionality, and like, I don't know. You can play Tetris on it, I think. It's completely ridiculous. But I think the reason that, that microwaves do this is kind of interesting. It's because it sells. People look at this and they think that, whoa, it must be advanced. And I think that's really why they do this. Not because it's better, but because it sells more. J2EE, I think, is a fantastic example of terrible usability. I'm a web developer, and when I look at the documentation for this stuff, I don't even understand how it works. I don't think anyone understands how it works. I don't think the people who build it understand how it works. So yeah, terrible from a usability point of view. 37 signals do this really well, I think. Sinatra is a really cool example of good usability, I think. They've sort of distilled web development down to its simplest form. And if you look at the first example they provide, the Hello World example, it's just so beautifully simple. So I really think that's a good example of this tier. And finally, pleasure. ATMs, they are terrible at this. They get the right functionality. They give me money. I like that. They're pretty usable. Everyone can understand how an ATM works. But they're usually miserable to use. They're slow, they're clunky, they're ugly. It's just not very pleasant to use them. Also Java. I think this is really where Java kind of fails. It's got the right functionality. It's a very capable programming language. It's fast. It's very good. It's also got the usability. It's very easy to learn. I would say it's easier to learn than Ruby. It's quite a small programming language at its core, but it's just a miserable experience to use it. It's just so wordy and so clunky, and you need all these extra tools, and all the tools are terrible, and it's just an unbearably terrible experience. And also the Google Maps API, I think it's the same thing. It's easy to understand, it does the job, but it's just not very pleasant to use. BMW, I think, is a company who does this really well. they really look at their product holistically, and they try in every way to make it as nice as possible. Also Apple, obviously. I think actually this is where Apple wins. People often talk about this usability of Apple products, and I actually think their usability is not much better than their competitors. They've always been very innovative, but I think their competitors have caught up. And now if you look at an Android phone and an iPhone, the Android phone is actually not harder to use. But the iPhone is nicer to use. It's more pleasurable to use. So I think this is where Apple wins. And I also think this is where Ruby wins. I think Ruby is one of the only languages. I think CoffeeScript is another one of my favorites, and I place it here as well. But Ruby is one of the only languages to really look at this top tier and to look at this pleasure tier and to try to improve that. So let's look at pleasure in more detail. Again, my friend Patrick Jordan, or I'd like to call him my friend, he's been talking about this 4 pleasures model, and that was originally proposed by a guy called LIONEL Tiger, who has the most awesome name in history. I would want to be called LIONEL Tiger. Yeah, so LIONEL Tiger proposed this model of the 4 pleasures. This is what he actually looks like. I still think he looks pretty badass. And the model goes like this. It's physio pleasures, social pleasures, psycho pleasures, and ideo pleasures. And I'm going to go over these in turn and explain a little bit more about what they mean. Physio pleasures, as you can guess from the name, is a pleasure to everything related to the physical world. So things your senses pick up: touch, smell, taste, possibly. I don't know if you swallow your products usually. That kind of thing. For us as software developers, it's not really very relevant. Our products usually don't manifest in the physical world, I hope. On the other hand, social pleasures might be very relevant to us. Maybe not so much for the actual code in our projects as for everything around them. Social pleasures are how you relate to other people, how you are seen, your self-image, status among your peers, those sort of things. Linux is terrible at this, I think. They've sort of managed to position themselves in a place where Linux is for nerds, and if you don't, and if you use Linux, you sort of self-identify as a nerd, and I think this prevents a lot of people from using the product. I think a lot of people would be very happy using Linux, but they are turned off by this idea of having to appear as part of this social circle. So I actually think this is kind of hurting the adoption of Linux in the desktop marketplace. Also quite recently in our community, RBEnv came out as an alternative to RVM. And the author of the project said some not so nice things about RVM in the project's README, which got a lot of people very upset. Wayne Seguin, the guy who wrote RVM, is a very, very well-liked person in the community, and so a lot of people came to his side and supported him and said, we're not going to use RBEnv just because the guy who wrote it was kind of being a dick in the README. So these kinds of things do have an impact on what people choose. A good example here would be something like this product, which is called the Novo Pen, which is a product for diabetics to measure their insulin levels. And the idea here is that to make it look as innocuous as possible, so that people who use this product don't feel like they're some kind of part of some kind of diseased or sick culture. It feels more like an everyday device. Like it looks like a pen. It just looks normal. And the idea is to help diabetic people feel more normal. And so in that sense, it provides social pleasure. Ruby on Rails, I think, has a really interesting relationship with this. Because in a sense, Ruby on Rails, through its code and through also through its community, has sort of provided a feeling of expertise, and we're really good at this, and sort of an elite clique of developers. And I think that's both a good thing for people coming into this community to feel like they are part of a really great group of people, but it also makes people outside the community look on us as kind of arrogant. And I think that's a problem, because it means that people who come into this community kind of feel that they don't want to be perceived as part of this fanboy Ruby on Rails clique. And I actually think this is driving some people away from the community. So what can you do to improve these things? Be inclusive. Think about everyone who would want to use your product, and try not to exclude them. Be humble when you talk about other projects. Most likely you've learned something from them, so give credit. You've probably even learned something from the failings of other projects, so be humble about that. Your project is probably going to fail in one way or another, and some smartass is going to stand there and point it out. Just be friendly in general. Be friendly to other people trying to understand your code. Be friendly on mailing lists if you're running an open source project. I know it's hard. People come asking stupid questions all the time, and you just want to sort of tell them to go read the fucking manual. But just think about the fact that you might be in that position at some point, and just be friendly. So next up, psycho pleasures. Contrary to what you might think, this is not about designing the perfect business card or explaining the benefits of Huey Lewis and the news. Psycho pleasures are about your emotional reaction to things, about frustration, for example, or the joy of having something work simply, about your cognitive response to your product. So a bad example would be Cassandra, the NoSQL database. I don't know if you guys have ever looked into that, but it basically gets the naming of everything wrong. Things don't really map to what you would expect them to be called. And there's actually tables on the internet where this is what it's called in Cassandra, and this is what it should have been called, because that would have made a lot more sense. That actually makes it a lot harder to get into it as a project, and makes it very frustrating in the beginning, because you constantly have to sort of map over what you would actually want things to be called. Also, SOAP is miserable in this experience, because you always think that you've got it figured out, and then you realize that you don't. Sinatra, again, I think is very good in this aspect. Also, TextMate, I think when it first came out, editors are hard, right? And TextMate just had this air of being easy and of being accessible. And I think when David demoed Rails for the first time in, I think, what was it, 2005 or something, I think that was a big part of the draw, this very simple editor that he was using, which is pretty and nice and human. So make it easy for people to get going. Provide good examples. Be consistent. If things look similar, they should work the same way. And make it smaller. Smaller components are always easier to understand than big components. So split your projects into smaller parts. Finally, ideo pleasures. All right, I should explain what this is. Ideo pleasures are pleasures relating to your values, to your perception of the world, to your ethics, to your religious beliefs, maybe, those kinds of things. Here we have, for example, this library which came up in the Ruby community called Red Carpet, which I'm not going to go into how, but it's a sexual pun. and this made a lot of people very angry, and they said it was misogynistic. It's not really important whether it is or it isn't. The point is that people felt uncomfortable using this product, and this in turn made it less pleasurable for them to use the product than if it would have been given a more neutral name. Ruby cones is a counterexample. We're sort of trying to, I think, follow the values of most people in this community to try to get people who aren't usually into programming and teaching them. And another good example, I think, is Aspec, just because it sort of embodies the values of this community of communication, of expressiveness, of creativity. And when it first came out, I think it really sort of changed the game in that up until then, all testing frameworks and almost all libraries of any kind were kind of written from a machine perspective. If you look at test units, it's very focused on just working with machines, whereas Aspec was meant for communication. It was meant for people. So know your audience. Know who you're working for. Don't be afraid to adopt an aesthetic. I really think that's one of the key things you can do to make your code more human. I really like, for example, Machinist in this aspect, if you ever use that, or Factory Girl, to sort of adopt an aesthetic of this idea of a machine worker building stuff. And it shows not only in the name of the library, but actually in the code itself. And I think that's a really nice thing to do. I think that's a good way to make your code more human. Consider cultural differences, because we are a global community, and what might be considered offensive in one place could be fine in another, and you wouldn't even know. So this is one way of mapping cultural differences. I'm not going to go into this a lot, but these are 5 different vectors against which you can map a culture. And this is backed by some science. And according to these, you can cluster cultures into different groups. And that's really interesting, and I encourage you to check that out, but that's really a topic for a presentation in of itself, so I'm not going to go into that too much here. So let's get into the practice of things. And I'm just going to check. I don't have a clock here, so okay. Right. Prototyping. I think this is a really important tool, and I think it's very underused. Don't be afraid to build stuff and throw it away, to sketch out ideas. Even if you're just writing code as part of your normal application, try different things. Try to see what works. Try different ideas. So for entire projects, this idea of README-driven development was proposed, and I really like that. I really like the idea of writing a narrative first, and to sort of look at who is your audience, what would they want to use this for, can you give a typical use case, what would a normal example of this look like, and so on and so forth. So write your examples first. Also, this idea of top-down design, I think that's really, that really helps with this. If you're building the top layer first, say in a Rails app, you're building your controller, then you've already sketched out which model methods you need. You've already sketched out how you're going to talk with the underlying layer, even though you actually haven't written that code yet. I think that's immensely useful, because then you can try different ideas in your controller very cheaply. You can see that, yeah, this interface looks really nice, and I would like to use something like this. And even though it's not built yet, you can play around with that. This is something we talked about at college a lot, kill your darlings. The idea is that you might come up with an idea off the top of your head, and you cling to that idea. You think that this is the best possible solution, and it prevents you from trying out different stuff. So if you come up with an idea for solving a problem, don't be afraid to just put it aside and try something else. try something new. Maybe you could use a block instead. Maybe you could use a hash argument. Maybe you could use a module or a class or whatever. There are lots of different design tools we have under our belt in Ruby. So don't be afraid to chuck out the initial idea you had and to try something else. And iterate. Try lots of different stuff. Refactoring, I really think this is the most important tool you have as a software developer. Refactoring is hugely underrated. We talk a lot about TDD, and often TDD is taken as write a test and make it pass. But I think this is much better, red-green refactor. This is a much better motto. Because if you're just writing a test and making it pass, I think you're missing the most important benefit of TDD, which is that it makes refactoring easier. So how do you refactor? Don't change functionality. If you're changing functionality, you're just changing shit. You're not refactoring at all. We sort of lose with the word refactoring, and I'm guilty of that myself. But we say like, yeah, I refactored this code to do something else. But that's not really a refactoring. Don't change the interface even. If you're refactoring, just look at, for example, a method or something, and just change the code below it. Then you're truly refactoring. And that also means don't change tests a lot. As you're making these changes, you want your tests to stay roughly the same. This is kind of why I don't like mocks so much, because I think they expose too much of the internals of the code to the tests. And I know there was a talk about this morning, and I'm probably wrong. But this is why I tend to prefer to not to use mocks. I want to talk about anti-patterns, and I want to talk about a particular anti-pattern. I want to talk about feature envy. I really think this is the most commonly occurring anti-pattern in code. It just basically means that shit's not in the right place. So you have code in one class which is supposed to be in another. You have given this object responsibilities which it's not supposed to have. So I just want to illustrate this with an example. Can you guys read that? So this invoice, which has a payment method, does a lot of credit card stuff. And this method, I think, is pretty ugly. But in order to change it, you could think that, oh, yeah, I could iterate over all these different credit card number and credit card date and set all of those or something to that effect. But actually, in this code, we have a lot of stuff here about credit card processing which really doesn't have anything to do with the invoice. So maybe we should extract that into its own object. And we're doing a lot of stuff with this order object, with this order association, and also that doesn't really belong here. So we could change it to something like this, where we're initializing a credit card, and we're asking it if it's valid, and we're checking for the balance. And now we can do these micro refactorings and make it look somewhat nicer. So does everything have the right name, and is everything in the right place? Those are, I think, the really important questions to ask yourself when you're doing refactoring. Consistency and style. This is, I think, the worst thing you can do when designing code. Rails has this nice method called link_to, which takes a text and a destination, and you would expect its sister method mail_to to do the same, but actually it doesn't. It's the other way around: mail to destination and text. This is, I think, the worst thing you can do in code. Just when you have similar stuff, make it consistent. It's not important which style you pick, just pick one. Don't be afraid to add some flavor to your code. I think it's really important for code to have a personality. And you would think that would sort of take the code back to being art, but I think it really takes it to being design, because design usually does have personality. So make your code human, because programming is fun. This is sort of what I want you to take away from this presentation. Make your code a pleasure to read, use, and modify. Thank you, guys.